Welcome to my channel. Hi everybody. Welcome back to my channel and to the following episode of Endless Journeys, which brings us to the fourth part of this series discussing the story of Lottie and her family who journeyed across the ocean in 1912 before at the time that the Titanic ship sank in 1912. And I just want to take this time out to say it's been such a pleasant day. It's a beautiful, balmy, 40-degree day in February. And I am so grateful that we're having a mild winter so far, just the way that I remember most of my Canadian winters. And, since I haven't been going to the tropics lately, I really appreciate these milder and warmer winters. It's no use sticking me in the middle of sub-zero temperatures. I will always try to escape somehow, somewhere, some way, those kinds of winters, because it's just, they're really unbearable for me. And it's not merely just the cold, it's everything else that comes with it, like the early sunsets and the endless gray days. I can do without those. Anyway, let's get on to the story. So this episode is actually, it deals precisely with the sinking of the Titanic, the actual episode where the ship sinks. And so, it's very exciting and it's very dramatic, especially the way that Lottie tells it. And for a couple of reasons, which I probably already discussed it. The way that she sees things is very different from the way that other people perceive things. And so in this account, and so also she refers to many ancient terms and biblical terms, which I'm going to go over with you very briefly at the end of the reading. But for now, let's just say that this is one of the most controversial versions that we can ever find regarding the sinking of the Titanic ship. But this account is filled with biblical and archaic symbolism, old systems, old phrases. And so if you feel like you are catching on to something, you can always refer back to the first part of this series where I discussed all those things that were bizarre and crazy that do fit in to this sort of account. And so that would be in the first part. And anyway, it might appear a little complex at times, this particular reading, and even because of that cognitive issue that makes Lottie see things that no one else actually does. Actually, guys, in its own way, it is a very complex account, and because of the simple fact that it is very objective and very truthful. She doesn't interject too many times her own feelings and opinions. So at times it feels kind of stilted, or it appears kind of as though there are missing facts or gaps or whatever. And so I'm just going to mention this now. Like that, you are clear about this as we get into the story. And so here is the reading. I hope that you enjoy it, and I hope that you can follow along with what I've been trying to imply. And anyway, I'm going to just start off. I hope you enjoy it. It must have been a time after 10 o'clock when my husband came in and woke me up. He sat about and talked to me for how long I do not know before he began to make ready to go to bed. And then a crash. The sensation to me was as if the ship had been seized by a giant hand and shaken once, twice, then stopped dead in its course. That is to say, there was a long backward jerk, followed by a shorter forward one. I was not thrown out of my berth, and my husband staggered on his feet only slightly. We heard no strange sounds, no rending of plates and woodwork. But we noticed that the engines had ceased running. They tried to start the engines a few minutes later, but after some coughing and rumbling, there was silence once more. Our cabin was so situated that we could follow this clearly. My husband and I were not alarmed. He said that there must have been some slight accident in the engine room, and at first he did not intend to go on deck. Then he changed his mind, put on his coat, and left me. I lay quietly in my berth, waiting with my little girl, and almost fell asleep again. In what seemed a very few moments, my husband returned. He was a bit excited then. "What do you think?" he exclaimed. "We have struck an iceberg, a big one, but there is no danger. An officer just told me so." I could hear the footsteps of people on the deck above my head. There was some stamping and queer noises, as if ship's tackle was being pulled about. "Are the people frightened?" I asked quietly. "No," he replied. "I don't think the shock waked up many in the second cabin, and a few of those in the saloons have troubled to go on deck. I saw 5 professional gamblers playing with some of the passengers as I went by. Their cards had been jerked off the table when the boat struck, but they were gathering them up and had started their game again before I left the saloon." The story reassured me. If those people at their cards were not worried, why should I be? I think my husband would have retired to his berth without asking any more questions about the accident. But suddenly, we heard hundreds of people running along the passageway in front of our door. They did not cry out, but the pattering of their feet reminded me of rats scurrying through an empty room. I could see my face in a mirror opposite, and it had grown very white. My husband, too, was pale, and he stammered when he spoke to me. "We had all better go on deck and see what's wrong," he said. So it's confusing for me because I found, this particular account that I'm going by differs slightly from one of the other versions in the fact that it has the family leaving to investigate the crash together as a group. And yet, in this particular version that I am reading, Harvey goes alone to investigate and then returns. And so I'm wondering if maybe they both occurred or if Lottie simply decided to leave one version out. I'm not sure. So that makes it a little more, it kind of changes things because that makes a big difference to how things actually happened and went down. And so, I'm thinking also of the fact that she may have been trying to gloss over some ugliness that might have occurred with Harvey and crew because he was a male. Although I don't think that Harvey would have been one to jump into the boat if he was instructed not to do so until all the women and children were saved. It doesn't strike me that that was the case, but it might be that somebody else there was having issues, and so maybe that kind of changed her story and she didn't want to include it. I'm not sure. And so anyway, guys, it does leave me wondering, but but I just went ahead with the account that she gave in the newspapers, and it basically doesn't change the sinking for sure, but it might have thrown off a few details here and there. I'm not sure. I jumped out of bed and put over my nightdress a dressing gown and an ulster. My hair was down, but I hurriedly tied it back with a ribbon. By this time, although the boat had not made any progress, it seemed to have tilted forward a little. I caught up my daughter Marjorie, just as she was in her nightgown, wrapped a White Star cabin blanket around her, and started out of the door. My husband followed immediately behind. Neither of us took any of our belongings from the cabin, and I remember that we even left his watch lying on his pillow. We did not doubt for an instant that we would return. When he reached the second cabin promenade deck, we found a great many people there. Some officers were walking up and down, shouting, "There is no danger whatever." It was a clear starlight night, but very cold. There was not a ripple on the sea. A few of the passengers were standing by the rail and looking down, but I want to say that, at that time, no one was frightened. My husband stepped over to an officer. It was either Fifth Officer Harold Lowe or First Officer Murdoch, and asked him a question. I heard the officer shout back, "No, we have no searchlight, but we have a few rockets on board. Keep calm, there is no danger." Our party of three stood close together. I did not recognize any of the other faces about me, probably because of the excitement. I never went near the first cabin promenade deck, so did not see any of the prominent people aboard. In this episode, um, remember I was discussing Nephilim. Well, Charlotte talks about a giant hand, uh, virtually God's will, that kind of reached out and manipulated all the activity that went on with the Titanic. A huge, giant hand. And that reminds us so much, or at least me, of the fallen angels and or Nephilim. And so that is something that really struck me right away when I first started reading this account. And at that point, I realized that I would have to do a lot of research in order to get to the bottom of how actually Lottie saw and interpreted the sinking. So even because Lottie was extremely religious, I remember what the steward said while discussing Devil's Hole, and despite all the talk about storms, we don't hear that from Lottie herself. Instead, what she said was there was not a ripple in the water, contrary to some of the other many accounts. I find this very strange. Was she hallucinating? Or did she simply not see it the way that other people saw it? Did the storm come up at a time when she was not really in that part of the water? I don't know. I don't know why. She comes right out and says there was not a ripple in the water. Now, I don't know if she means by that to mean something else by the word ripple. I don't know what she's talking about. How can it be that other accounts include a storm and hers doesn't? I have to wonder. I'm not saying that she's being dishonest. I'm saying that I find it also so fascinating that this perspective differs from other accounts. Not all of them. Some of them fall into this category of not seeing a storm, but yeah, it's weird. Suddenly, there was a commotion near one of the gangways, and we saw a stoker come climbing up from below. He stopped a few feet away from us. All the fingers of one hand had been cut off. Blood was running from the stumps, and blood was spattered over his face and over his clothes. The red marks showed very clearly against the coal dust with which he was covered. I started over and spoke to him. I asked him if there was any danger. "Danger!" he screamed at the top of his voice. I should just say so. It's hell down below. Look at me. This boat'll sink like a log in 10 minutes. He staggered away and lay down, fainting, with his head on a coil of rope. And at that moment, I got my first grip of fear. Awful, sickening fear. That poor man with his bleeding hand and his speckled face brought up a picture of smashed engines and mangled human bodies. I hung on to my husband's arm, and although he was very brave and was not trembling, I saw that his face was as white as paper. We realized that the accident was much worse than we had supposed. But even then, I, and all the others about me of whom I have any knowledge, did not believe that the Titanic could go down. The officers now were running to and fro and shouting orders. I have no clear idea of what happened during the next quarter of an hour. The time seemed much shorter, but it must have been between 10 and 15 minutes. I saw First Officer Murdoch place guards by the gangways to prevent others like the wounded stoker from coming on deck. How many unhappy men were shut off in that way from their one chance of safety, I do not know. But Mr. Murdoch was probably right. He was a masterful man, astoundingly brave and cool. I had met him the day before when he was inspecting the second cabin quarters, and thought him a bulldog of a man who would not be afraid of anything. This proved to be true. He kept order to the last and died at his post. They say he shot himself. I do not know. Suddenly, there was a commotion near one of the gangways, and we saw a stoker come climbing up from below. I was talking about biblical phrases and references, and so the one that I'm particularly looking at right now is the one in Matthew, where the quote goes, "If your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it from you. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than to have 2 hands or 2 feet and be cast into the eternal fire. So I don't really think like that, but this is precisely what I think Lottie may have been thinking when she saw the man or the steward, I don't remember if he was a crew member or a passenger, who said he had just lost a limb. I think he was referring to his right hand. Well, guys, that's weird, okay? And I'm going to tell you why. Why is it weird? Well, because nowhere in any of the other accounts do I hear any passengers or crew members discussing the loss of anyone's limb. And she goes into detail about blood and things like that. Nobody saw anything similar to that. And so I'm wondering a couple of things. Was Lottie hallucinating? Well, that is part of what her condition was doing to her. Her tuberculosis was giving her hallucinations, visual and audio hallucinations. Was Lottie simply trying to find a way to cope internally, emotionally, with the, she saw the Titanic as God's will. So was she trying to make heads or tails of it with this account by interjecting her ideas that humankind was sinful and therefore was being punished with the sinking of the Titanic? I'm not saying that this did not happen. I'm actually assuming that the guy with the torn off limb never existed. The only way that I can account for my assumption that he didn't exist and was a figment of her hallucination was the fact that it's not backed up by anything, any other story, any other account. There's one passenger who did lose the use of his legs, but that was after the incident of being overboard. He survived. I think he was one of the people who went overboard and got rescued. He lost the use of his legs, but it's not the same context that Lottie is describing. So that is the only story that I came up with regarding the loss of limbs. And he didn't lose them. He just became paralyzed. I don't think he lost them. I believe that he became paralyzed. I'm not sure now because that account to me that I found was not altogether that clear. Now, did all these things in Lottie's mind actually occur exactly the way that she described them, or were they just merely thoughts in her mind? Well, your guess is as good as mine. Obviously, the giant hand was something that she interjected because that is how she saw it. And I think that her perspective is very useful and so enlightening to me. And so, take from it what you will. I find her account so fascinating. So, because of the torn limb that she puts into this story, I believe actually what was at the heart of Lottie's meaning and thoughts and how she was digesting all of this and trying to make logical sense of it was that she almost referred to the blood uh, as I don't know how to say this, Nephilim blood. It could be that she was suggesting that his blood was different from hers, or ours, if you will, in the meaning that he did display fear. He was also being very brave. He was somewhere in the middle, like a giant, right? He had that hybrid quality of being half human and half giant, right? He was still scared, but he was still being brave. I find this account so overwhelmingly insightful. Those in charge herded us toward the nearest boat deck. That is where I presently found myself, still clinging to my husband's arm, and with little Marjorie beside me. Many women were standing with their husbands, and there was no confusion. Then, above the clamor of people asking questions of each other, there came the terrible cry, "Lower the boats! Women and children first!" Someone was shouting those last four words over and over again. Women and children first. Women and children first. They struck utter terror into my heart, and now they will ring in my ears until I die. They meant my own safety, but they also meant the greatest loss I have ever suffered, the life of my husband. The first lifeboat was quickly filled and lowered away. Very few men went in her, only 5 or 6 members of the crew, I should say. The male passengers made no attempt to save themselves. I never saw such courage or believed it possible. How the people in the first cabin and the steerage may have acted, I do not know. But our second-class cabin men were heroes. I want to tell that to every reader of this article. Those in charge herded us toward the nearest boat deck. That is why, everybody, I kind of wonder, and I'm not saying that I'm right. I have to keep it in the back of my head. Did Harvey actually perish with all the money? Or did he escape? Did he actually get on another lifeboat and disappear? Because those people who got on other lifeboats, they basically disappeared. They all met up again on the Carpathia that came to rescue the Titanic victims. But we don't know exactly for sure if Harvey actually just disappeared or actually really perished. And, we have to keep an open mind with these things because it is an awfully weird story, the way that Lottie narrates it. And so we have to wonder, did he really perish? Was the bleeding hand actually real. There is no way to solve it, right? So we absolutely must question the context of what and the reality of what Lottie actually says and sees and does. We have to question it. We have to look at it in a different way than we would look at, say, her account of her life in Bishopstoke. Because at that point in Bishopstoke, yeah, she was not well, but she was not frenzied, she was not panicked, she was not in the middle of a crisis. She was actually quite calm and collect. So there's a big difference in the way that she reacts to situations, right? Body also refers to several other ancient systems or phrases, and the most prominent one that I've studied in university, because my American professors, a professor couple, they wrote books together, and they're still very much in that process. They wrote magnificent history books together. And in one of these books was the mention of the coiled rope. And I'm not going to bring up the title of the book because that would be copyright. I know that my professors would get angry with me. So I'm not going to mention the university or the professors' names, but it was a fascinating series of books that us students purchased for this particular history course. And guys, it was a fascinating Renaissance history is where the coiled rope phrase actually I don't know how to say this. It was like a cultural thing that was very prominent in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And people kind of associated coiled rope with sacrifice. And, here it's a direct reference to Egypt as well. And the number 100, which is a basic structure of units in ancient Egyptian systems. And so it also refers to a long or a short passage of time. If a rope is coiled, as when the young lad lay his head down on the coiled rope to transpire and wait for his deathly fate. A coiled rope means short time, a very brief period of time. So why is this essential and particular phrase in Lottie's speech? If she were regarding the sinking as God's will, she would be also regarding it as sacrifice, right? And she referred to the man who tried to jump from overboard into the lifeboat as a Nephilim, because to show fear meant that someone was not good. It is a very archaic way of thinking, but there you go. That was her way. That was her conventional, standard way of thought, of thinking. And so in regards to her specific context, the coiled rope refers to British occupation in Egypt until 1914. So Egypt was a very fixed fixture in Lottie's context at that time. So it didn't have really much of the British occupation there didn't really have much of a legal stand, but it was as regarded as a de facto protectorate over Egypt, and not actually. Egypt was not actually part of the British Empire. So this state of affairs politically lasted until 1914. And so that is when the Ottoman Empire joined World War I, and Britain declared a protectorate over Egypt. So that is probably where all of her connections to Egypt and references to Egypt basically came from. Now, Egypt is also very, in my way of thinking, very close to the Bible. The Bible was actually begun by Egyptian kings and finished off by others. So, I'm just rambling on here. I'm trying to make sense of why Lottie throws this in. And we do actually see that she refers to the young lad as fearful, but she has a compassion for him. She wanted to save him. In my mind, I believe that she did want to save him, and so did other people on that lifeboat, but he was taken off and made to stand his ground like a man, even though he wasn't ready for death, the poor boy. So Lottie had a heart, and I hope I don't start crying. So I hope that you were able to see the complexities of this story. All the people rushing to and fro, and meanwhile she tells us that we were not afraid and there was no confusion. Maybe momentarily there was stability and there was calmness, but I really, especially after seeing Titanic 2 as well, I doubt that there was a consistent and stable state of calm and fearlessness aboard. I'm sure that everybody showed fear, but probably many of them, like Lottie, were afraid to show it and talk about it. It must have been so frightening to have to feel that need to conduct yourself in an appropriate way in order to avoid criticism and be going through something like this. How does one do it? I don't know how she did it. I actually, and I'll probably say this again later on in other episodes, I actually think that maybe her cognitive issues with tuberculosis, they helped her cope. They helped her struggle between fantasy and reality. And so she was always at the edge of accepting, is this real or is this not real? What do I do? How do I react? So she was always calm. Now, guys, I don't know about the medical industry in those days, the medical field, how far the doctors had gone into talking to Harvey and Lottie about her condition, but I'm sure that she was, by this stage, somewhat aware of it, right? Maybe the people aboard ship were also made aware of it or became aware of it. I'm not sure. I wasn't there. But obviously she was having cognitive issues. And, well, I really feel for this passenger. Her life was about to crumble and change and transform into something completely different. But we'll have to wait and see. And so I really hope that you have enjoyed this part of the discussion. The next part, the next episode, will deal with the actual rescue. And so I really hope you enjoyed listening to me talk and give my ideas on it. It is so controversial, and we're going to find out even more about the controversy, other parts of it in the next episode. Oh, it's so dramatic. And so I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much for listening and watching. And please subscribe in order to join us for the next episode. And so take care, and I'll see you soon.